All right, let's dive into a substance that you probably think you know inside and out. But I guarantee its history is way more epic than you can imagine. We're talking about a simple mineral, something sitting on your kitchen table right now, that literally built empires and shaped the course of human history.
So let's kick things off with a little puzzle. Think about it. What on earth connects an ancient soldier from the Roman Empire to a piece of bacon on your breakfast plate? It seems random, right? But there's a single crucial link between them that stretches across thousands of years. And the answer is salt. Get this, the word salary actually comes from the Latin word salarium, which was the money Roman soldiers got specifically to buy salt. Yeah, it was that important. And of course, it's the very same ingredient that turns pork into bacon. But why? What is it about this humble crystal that gives it such world-changing power?
Well, to really get it, we have to zoom way in, down to the microscopic level. You see, keeping food from going bad isn't just about keeping it dry. It's an all-out chemical war, a battle waged against these invisible armies of decay. We're talking bacteria and mold that want to reclaim anything and everything.
Salt's main weapon in this war is a process you might remember from high school chemistry, osmosis. It's all about where water wants to go. And here's the thing. Every living cell, especially a bacterial cell, is basically a tiny bag of water. It needs that water to live. Salt completely hijacks this need with, honestly, brutal efficiency.
And here's exactly how that attack goes down. First, you put salt on the meat, and it creates this super concentrated salty environment on the surface. Now, nature absolutely hates an imbalance like that. So water just rushes out of the food cells and, more importantly, right out of any bacteria hanging around to try and dilute the salt. This leads to the final, fatal step, plasmolysis. It's a fancy word, but it just means death by dehydration. The bacteria literally shrivel up and die. Game over.
But, the story doesn't stop there. In fact, this is where it gets really interesting. Because for most of human history, the salt people were using wasn't the pure white stuff we have today. Nope, it was mined from the earth full of all kinds of other minerals and, well, impurities. And it turns out that some of these impurities, things like nitrates and nitrites, weren't a bug. They were a feature. They were an accidental, game-changing upgrade. What started as just a quirk of geology became the absolute key to creating the cured meats that we know and love. And this shows you just how big a difference it made. I mean, pure salt works, sure, but it leaves the meat looking this dull, unappetizing gray color. But salt with nitrates? Whoa! It does so much more. It keeps that vibrant, pinkish red color we expect. It adds this amazing, distinct flavor. And this is the big one. It kills the bacteria that causes botulism, which is one of the most lethal foodborne illnesses out there. So here's the magic trick at the chemical level. Those nitrites create something called nitric oxide, and that bonds with a protein in the muscle. This creates a whole new, super stable compound that locks in that familiar reddish-pink color. And that reaction, that's the secret sauce. It's the reason your ham is pink and not gray. Okay, so humanity figures out the basic science. The next big question is, how do you scale it up? How do you use this chemistry to feed armies, navies, and entire cities? Well, that led to two major industrial scale methods. So on one side, you've got dry curing. This is where you're literally rubbing the meat with salts and letting it dry out for weeks, maybe months. This makes the food incredibly lightweight and durable, think prosciutto, or the dried codfish that fueled the Vikings. Then on the other side, you have wet pickling, or brining. You're just soaking the meat in these huge watertight barrels filled with salt water. This method was way faster, and it was perfect for provisioning the massive navies during the Age of Sail with tons and tons of salt pork. And this is the really crucial part. Mastering preservation wasn't just about making better food. It was a massive, fundamental shift that changed what was even possible for us as a species. Before salt, humanity was basically tethered to its immediate surroundings. You might have a huge hunt, a massive catch of fish, but that was a fleeting moment. You had to eat it all before it spoiled. That constant threat of decay put a hard limit on travel, on expansion, on just surviving the winter. Salt cut that tether. And once that tether was cut, everything changed. Suddenly, long-distance exploration was possible. Navies could project power across entire oceans. Things like cod, which would rot in days, could be turned into an economic powerhouse that built fortunes. For the very first time, human societies could actually stockpile energy. They could save the abundance of summer to survive the harsh scarcity of winter. So, given how incredibly vital salt was for survival, for wealth, for power, it's really no surprise that it also became this huge cultural symbol. It's pretty simple, really. If you controlled the salt, you controlled a lot. And just having access to it became a super clear, obvious way to show who was rich and powerful and who wasn't. For centuries, this mineral was a luxury, and it literally drew a line between the haves and the have-nots.
And this phrase makes that idea totally literal. Picture a medieval feast. There'd be this big, fancy salt cellar placed on the main table. If you were an honored guest, a noble, you sat above the salt, close to the host with easy access. But everyone else, the commoners, the less important people, they sat below the salt. Your physical position, relative to a bowl of seasoning, told everyone in the room exactly what your social standing was.
So today, we're going to trace the incredible journey of seawater as it moves through this amazing solar engine. We'll start with how it all works, then see how we tamed the ocean itself, navigated a labyrinth of brine, created two totally different kinds of salts, and finally, what happened when the sun just wasn't enough.
All right, first up, the solar engine. Now, producing salt on an industrial scale wasn't about just letting some water dry out in a puddle. No, this required a deep, deep mastery of environmental forces, all channeled through some truly incredible engineering.
At the very heart of this was the coastal Saltern, and you have to forget any image of a simple pond. This was a machine. Places like Guernsey in Brittany and Trapani in Sicily are these amazing examples where the entire coastline was terraformed, re-engineered into this tiered, impermeable landscape designed for one single purpose: harvesting the sun. The challenge they faced was just immense. I mean, think about it. How do you pull one pure chemical compound, sodium chloride, out of the complete chaos of the ocean? It took a synthesis of geology, meteorology, and even metallurgy to get it right. So how did this whole machine actually work? Well, before you can even think about harnessing the sun, you first have to tame the ocean itself. And that starts with the immense power of the tides. The whole process kicks off by letting seawater rush in at high tide into this massive primary reservoir they call the Vasier. Now, this basin was huge, sometimes making up almost half of the entire saltworks. And it wasn't just for storage, it was basically a giant settling pond, letting all the silt and mud sink to the bottom, a really critical step for preventing contamination down the line. And the person managing this whole operation was the paludier, the salt worker. These people needed an incredibly intimate knowledge of the tidal cycles to operate all the trap doors and canals just right. And a lot of these designs were ancient, with some tracing all the way back to 10th century monks who had perfected this dance between wind, sun, and tide. But here's the thing, that purified water doesn't crystallize right away. Oh no. First, it has to navigate a carefully designed labyrinth, a gauntlet built to seriously ramp up its salt content. This labyrinth is called the Kobir. The brine is guided mostly by gravity through this long series of winding ponds. And the architecture here is absolutely key. It is all about maximizing the surface area exposed to the sun and, just as importantly, to the wind. That's what drives evaporation as efficiently as possible. Now, this stage isn't just chemical, it's biological. It's pretty cool, actually. As the salinity shoots up, the brine itself becomes a weapon. It gets so concentrated that it starts to kill off competitors like algae and tiny crustaceans, things the salt workers literally called enemies of the harvest because they could totally ruin the final product. Okay, so in this final stage, the super concentrated brine is guided into one last set of shallow crystallization tanks, known as the oyettes. And this is where the real magic happens. What's just fascinating is that you get two different physical phenomena happening in the very same tank, creating two completely different and economically vital types of salt. You see heavy crystals sink and mix with the minerals in the clay bottom, forming groselle, that coarse gray salt. This was the workhorse, the engine of preservation for curing meat and fish. But under perfect conditions, hot sun and a dry breeze, a delicate crust of beautiful pyramidal crystals would form right on the surface. That was fleur de sel, the flower of salt, which was gently skimmed off and saved for the tables of the rich and powerful. The entire solar engine was magnificent, right? A perfect synthesis of landscape and technique. But it had one massive, fatal flaw. It was completely, utterly dependent on the weather.
So that really begs the question. This system worked beautifully in the sunny Mediterranean, but what happened when civilization and the demand for salt
pushed north into totally different climates. Well, it turns out, climate was destiny. In the damp, cool climates of Northern Europe, the sun simply wasn't strong enough. It couldn't drive the massive evaporation needed to salt the great fishing fleets of the North Sea. The solar engine, it just faltered.
Look, ancient engineers like the Phoenicians and Romans, they pushed this solar technology to its absolute limits. They mechanized the landscape with things like windmills and built these incredibly durable channels with hydraulic cement. But even their amazing ingenuity had a limit. They couldn't control the sun.
And so a great technological pivot had to happen. The source material says it best. To meet that ever-growing demand, humanity had to turn to fire. And that meant a fundamental world-changing shift from harnessing renewable energy to consuming fuel.
That tiny, perfect crystal of salt, it didn't just appear, especially in the colder parts of Northern Europe. Creating it was this huge industrial challenge, a mystery of science and craft that completely reshaped the world around it.
Okay, so to really get this, you have to forget everything you might know about making salt from, say, the sunny Mediterranean. In places like England or Germany or Austria, they weren't getting salt by evaporating seawater. Nope, they were boiling it out of ancient brine springs, deep underground. And that meant they needed a totally different kind of engine. Not one that ran on the sun, but one that ran on the raw, roaring power of fire.
And this is where it gets really interesting. See, solar salt is passive, right? It totally depends on the weather and where you are. But boiled salt, that's an active, industrial process. It's like a thermal engine you can run 24/7 in any weather as long as you can keep feeding it fuel. And that fundamental shift from a passive process to an active one, that's where our story really kicks into high gear.
So at the very heart of this thermal engine was one key piece of tech, the boiling pan. And honestly, the centuries-long quest to build the perfect pan is this incredible story of medieval engineers just constantly running into one problem after another.
So let's kind of walk through how this whole thing evolved. Way back, they just used simple ceramic pots. Makes sense. But by the Roman era, lead pans were the gold standard. And lead was great. I mean, it was easy to shape, easy to repair, and, this is crucial, it didn't rust. That meant the salt stayed sparkling white. But lead had a fatal flaw.
And this pretty much says it all. See, to make more salt and to make it faster, producers started switching from wood to coal, which burns way hotter. But that intense heat, the very thing they needed to ramp up production, would literally melt their most important piece of equipment. Their technology had just hit a brick wall. Okay, so the obvious fix was to switch to iron pans. But that opened up a whole new can of worms. Sure, they could take the heat, no problem. But they were incredibly expensive to make and move. And even worse, the super salty brine made them rust like crazy, which would stain the salt this reddish-brown color. And in a market where whiteness meant purity, that was a huge deal breaker. So you have this constant battle against rust and decay, which actually led to a brand new job, the pansmith. These guys were constantly maintaining these huge iron vessels. It wasn't a one-and-done purchase, it was a perpetual and very expensive war against corrosion. But here's the thing. Getting the hardware right was only half the problem. If you wanted that pure, snow-white salt, you needed more than a good pan and a hot fire. You needed secret knowledge, a kind of practical alchemy that was passed down from master to apprentice. And the person who held all these secrets, they were known as the Waller. Now, this wasn't just some guy shoveling fuel. This was a master craftsman, part scientist, part magician really, who understood the strange and delicate chemistry of making salt. The entire operation lived or died on their skill. So how'd they do it? It was way more complicated than just boiling water. First, they'd hit the brine with a violent boil, a process called sludging, which made impurities like iron drop to the bottom. But to get the really good stuff, they had to move on to step 2, clarification. And this involved, well, some pretty unusual ingredients.
Yep, you heard that right. To clarify, the brine, the Waller would add things like animal blood or egg whites or even ale. I know it sounds absolutely bizarre, but the science was actually solid. The proteins in these things would clump together or coagulate in the boiling brine, trapping all the nasty little impurities in a foam that they could just skim right off the top. What was left was a pure, crystal clear liquid.
Okay, so now the brine is perfectly pure, but the Waller's job isn't done. Now comes the final, most delicate challenge, actually controlling the shape and size of the salt crystals. Because believe it or not all salt was the same. Different customers needed different products. You can see the two main types here.
If you did a rapid, hard boil, you got fine salt, perfect for the dinner table. But for the huge fishing industry, you needed coarse fishery salt. To get that, you had to simmer the brine slowly, sometimes for days. And why? Because those bigger crystals dissolved slower, which was perfect for curing fish on long sea voyages without just burning the flesh. This was a high-tech, specialized product for a global industry.
And managing this whole delicate dance hinged on one critical moment. It was called the leap. This was the exact point when the brine got so saturated with salt that the crystals just started to pop into existence. You couldn't time this with a clock. It was pure intuitive craft. It all came down to the experienced eye of a master waller who could spot that subtle shift and control the fires with absolute precision.
And just when you thought blood and eggs were strange, get ready for this. To actually control how the crystals grew, wallers would add surfactants, things like butter, tallow, and yes, even earwax. They would add this stuff to change the surface tension of the brine. It's an absolutely astonishing level of craft that let them literally design the perfect salt crystal for any given job. But all of this incredible innovation, this amazing craftsmanship, it has a really dark side. That thermal engine, with its voracious, never-ending appetite for fuel to boil millions of gallons of brine, well, it came at a staggering environmental cost.
In a place like Lüneburg, Germany, the saltworks literally devoured all the forests for miles around. And once the wood was gone, they just started digging up the land for peat, completely reshaping the entire landscape.
On the Danish island of Lezo, the result was even more extreme. The salt industry consumed every single tree, turning the island into a windswept desert. And with no more fuel, the whole industry just collapsed. It left behind a total ecological catastrophe.
And in England, this massive demand for fuel was a huge driver in the nation's big shift to coal. It tied the salt industry to the coal fields and helped create those dark, smoky, iconic landscapes we all associate with the Industrial Revolution.
So when you really look at that simple crystal, you're seeing a much bigger story. It's a story of sophisticated metallurgy, of strange and secret chemistry, and ultimately of a profound and often devastating ecological crisis.
We're going to explore how this simple mineral was actually a world-shaping force, something that built massive fortunes and literally forged empires.
Kind of invisible force behind the rise of massive empires, the explosion of global trade, and yeah, even the spark that lit the Industrial Revolution. See, this story isn't just about a mineral, it's really about a revolution in preservation. The ability to make salt on an industrial scale, well, at its heart, that was an export revolution, and it completely, totally reshaped the world. So, let's dive into the first ripple effect, the economic one. You've probably heard of the Hanseatic League, right? That medieval commercial powerhouse? Well, its entire empire was pretty much built on one thing, the perfect synergy between German salt and Scandinavian fish.
Okay, let's zero in on a city called Lüneburg. Its entire reason for existing was a massive salt mine right in the middle of it. And this wasn't just some town with a mine nearby. No, this place was a fortress with huge walls and towers built for one reason, to guard its salty treasure.
And the scale of this operation, it's just staggering. I mean, we're talking about 54 different boiling huts, housing more than 200 industrial-sized boiling pans. This was no cottage industry, folks. This was basically a proto-factory system, a highly organized industrial machine.
And of course, a machine like this creates a whole new social structure. At the very top, you had the Salzbeguter, basically the salt gentry. These were the guys who owned the means of production, the salt pans. They'd lease them out to master salters, and just like that, you have this clear hierarchy of capital and labor that controlled the whole city. This whole system created a supply chain that literally fed a continent. So, the salt from Lüneburg gets transported to Lübeck. From there, it's shipped to the Scania market over in Sweden. And that's where hundreds of thousands of barrels of herring were preserved with it. This created a food source so reliable that it allowed populations to boom in places like northern Norway, places where farming was pretty much impossible. Okay, so as you can imagine, all this trade created brand new problems, and problems demand new solutions, right? For instance, how do you transport this massive amount of salted food? That one question, it ended up driving some major technological innovation. I mean, think about it for a second. You can't just throw a bunch of salted fish onto a ship. If you have a leaky barrel, you lose the brine that's preserving everything, and that means your entire cargo rots. For a ship on a long voyage, that wasn't just a financial loss, that was an absolute catastrophe.
So this whole process became absolutely critical. First, the fish are caught, then they're packed in all that salt, and finally they're sealed up in perfectly watertight oak casks to be shipped. All of a sudden, the craft of cooperage, barrel making, it became just as vital to global trade and exploration as, say, navigation itself. Pretty wild.
Now, this incredible technology didn't just fuel trade, it also fueled military ambition. For an outfit like the British Empire, salt preservation became the logistical backbone of its entire global dominance.
The Royal Navy, they developed this incredibly meticulous, almost scientific process to make meat last for years at sea. You couldn't just chuck it in a barrel with some salt. Oh no, it was this whole multi-day procedure. We're talking dry rubs, special brines to clear out impurities, and super careful layering with different types of salt.
And you gotta love this part. It had this wonderfully simple, pragmatic test to make sure the final brine was strong enough. It had to be so dense with salt that it could literally float an egg. That was the guarantee. It meant the solution was hypertonic, which is just a fancy way of saying it would stop all bacterial growth dead in its tracks.
So to put it simply, without this reliable, long-lasting food supply, there's just no way the Royal Navy could have maintained its globe-spanning blockades. No way they could have patrolled their distant colonies. The entire British Empire, in a very real sense, sailed on a sea of brine.
But all of this industrial-scale production came at a really steep price, and that's the final ripple we're going to look at. The hidden and pretty devastating environmental and social costs of this whole revolution.
So if you look at English towns like Cheshire, the demand for brine was just insatiable. It meant they had to dig deeper and deeper. And to pump all that brine to the surface, the salt industry hooked up with the most advanced tech of the day, the brand new steam engine.
And the consequences? They were devastating. This aggressive, non-stop pumping of underground brine, it was dissolving the very salt rock foundations the towns were built on. And the result was catastrophic subsidence. We're talking about the ground literally collapsing, swallowing whole buildings into giant craters.
This industry also created a totally new kind of workforce. You had these specialized jobs: lumpmen who molded the salt, firemen who managed the furnaces, lofters who moved the finished product, and even pansmiths whose whole job was to constantly repair the corroding iron equipment. This intense division of labor, you can see it, right? It's a direct forerunner to the factory systems that would come to define the 19th century.
For centuries, this simple common seasoning was actually a massive tool of social division, a symbol of incredible wealth, and even a focal point for the fear of being assassinated. Yeah, let's get into this hidden history. You've probably heard someone is worth their salt, but there's this other much weirder phrase, sitting above the salt. It just sounds like some old-timey saying, doesn't it? But it points to a very real and very rigid social structure that was basically the law of the dinner table. So back in medieval dining halls, being above or below the salt was not a figure of speech at all. It was a literal line, a line drawn by a salt cellar that decided your place in the world. And it all played out over a single meal. To really get this, you have to picture a medieval dining hall. This wasn't just a place to eat. It was a theater of power. And the seating arrangement? That was the script everyone had to follow. Okay, so it all centered around the high table. This was often literally raised up on a platform, a dais. That's where the Lord, his family, and his most important guests sat. And right in front of the Lord was the Great Salt, this huge ornate salt cellar. Now, if you were seated above the salt, between that cellar and the Lord, you were in the inner circle. You mattered. Everyone else, well, they sat below the salt, stretching way down these long tables, physically and symbolically miles away from power. But it gets even crazier. The division went deeper than just your location in the room. It actually came down to the salt itself. The very salt you tasted depended entirely on where you were sitting. If you were lucky enough to be above the salts, you got the good stuff. We're talking pure white, super refined salts, totally free of any impurities. A true luxury. But for everyone sitting below the salt, they got the common stuff. It was unrefined, often gray or even black, and it was full of grit, mud, even had a chemical bitterness to it. So the food on their plate literally tasted different, harsher, grittier than the food of their superiors just a few feet away. This created a genuine sensory gap. The wealthy didn't just have nicer homes, their whole experience of the world, right down to the actual taste on their tongue, was purer and cleaner. And because the salt was so valuable, the thing that held it wasn't just some shaker. Oh no, it was a treasure. Seriously, forget the fancy plates or the silverware. In a lot of noble houses, the salt cellar was the single most valuable object on the entire table. Think about it. In a time when making pure salt was incredibly hard and expensive, showing off a huge pile of it was the ultimate power move. It was a centerpiece that just screamed, "I am rich and I am powerful." And these things were made from the most ridiculously lavish materials you can imagine. We're talking solid gold, gleaming silver gilt, huge chunks of rock crystal, agate, and even rare exotic nautilus shells. These weren't just dishes. They were masterpieces of art, designed to just completely blow away anyone who saw them. And the granddaddy of them all was the Nef. This was a massive, spectacular salt cellar shaped like a ship. The symbolism here was just perfect. The ship represented the sea, which is where salt comes from, sure, but more importantly, it represented the source of the host's wealth, all that overseas trade and exploration. It was basically a personal monument sitting on the dinner table. But, the salt cellar had another, much darker job. In an age of constant backstabbing and political drama, a shared meal could easily become a death trap. Just think about it for a second. If you want to poison a powerful lord, what's the sneakiest way to do it? You slip it into a dish that everyone shares. And what's easier to mix a little powdered arsenic into than a big bowl of powdered salt? Everybody knew this, which turned the lord's personal salt supply into a major source of paranoia.
And this is where that ship-shaped Nef became a kind of personal safe. The hall would actually lock away the Lord's private utensils and, this is the crucial part, his tools for the ritual poison test, called the essay. They would use something called a serpent's tongue, which was actually a fossilized shark tooth, to test the salt. People believed this tooth would magically start to sweat or change color if poison was nearby. This whole dramatic ritual happened right there at the table, a constant reminder of the danger that could be lurking in every single bite.
So, with social status and literally life or death stakes on the line, it is absolutely no surprise that a very strict code of conduct grew up around the simple act of taking a pinch of salt.
For the elite, the only proper way to take salt was to use the very tip of your clean knife to put a small amount on your plate. To do anything else, like say dipping your greasy piece of meat right into the main salt cellar, was seen as completely disgusting and uncivilized. It wasn't just bad manners, it was a neon sign that you didn't belong. You were seen as someone who would contaminate the precious supply, which marked you as unrefined and totally unworthy of a seat above the salt.
And the diplomatic stakes? Oh, they could be absolutely astronomical. Get this. In 1378, the King of France was hosting two other incredibly powerful monarchs. So they had a huge problem. Whose seat do you put the one great salt in front of? To honor one king would be to deeply insult the other two. The solution? They brought out 3 separate, equally magnificent salt cellars and placed one in front of each monarch. Crisis averted.
So here's the bottom line. The salt cellar was so much more than a dining accessory. Its placement, what it was made of, the rules around it, it all transformed this object into a direct stand-in for the power and sovereignty of the host himself. To touch it the wrong way or question where it was placed, that was like challenging the ruler to his face.
All right, today we're jumping back in time, way back to ancient China. We're going to uncover this revolutionary idea, a financial concept so powerful it completely changed how governments pay for things. And believe me, its echoes are still rattling around in your wallet today.
I mean, really think about that. What if every single meal you ate helped pay for an army? A little slice of what you paid for dinner tonight going straight to the state, and you wouldn't even see it on the bill. Now that might sound like some modern scheme, but it's not. It's an ancient idea, and it all revolves around one single, super essential mineral: salt.
So how on earth did this come about? Well, it all started with this absolutely brilliant solution to a problem that, let's be honest, every ruler in history has faced. People hate paying taxes.
And this is just, it's brutal in its simplicity, right? If you tax people's land directly or you tax their income, they see that money physically leaving their hands. And what happens? They get angry, they hide their money, and sometimes they even rebel. So the genius solution was, what if we stop taxing people directly and instead we just control something that every single person has to have to survive?
Okay, so the man behind this whole thing was a guy named Guanzong. And you gotta understand, he wasn't just some politician. He was like a master of human psychology. He totally got that the most effective tax is the one people don't even know they're paying. His whole philosophy was super pragmatic, almost Machiavellian, you know? It's like, why fight with your citizens when you can get them to fund the state totally willingly every single day? And this quote from him just illustrates the strategy so perfectly. By controlling the mountains and seas, the state can extract revenue from every bowl of soup without the people knowing. Just think about that. You control the sources, the salt mines, the ironworks, and boom, you control the revenue. Every preserved fish, every seasoned dish sends this tiny, invisible little stream of cash straight to the government. You don't need tax collectors banging on doors. You don't have angry peasants at the gates. It's just the quiet, constant funding of an entire empire.
So, Guanzong's idea, it was brilliant, but for centuries it just stayed a theory. A really powerful theory, but just a theory. But then an emperor came along. An emperor with huge ambitions and even bigger bills to pay. And he decided it was time to put this theory into practice on a scale that was just massive. And you can see here, there's a huge gap between the idea and when it actually happens. Guanzong proposes this way back in the 7th century BCE. But it wasn't until the Han Dynasty, under this really ambitious guy, Emperor Wu, that the pressures of war and politics finally turned this concept into real imperial policy. And in 119 BCE, he made it official. The state was taking over the salt and iron business.
So why'd he do it? Well, Emperor Wu was fighting these incredibly expensive, decades-long wars against the Xiongnu nomads. He needed cash, and a lot of it. But, and this is so crucial, this wasn't just about money. See, a really powerful merchant class had gotten super rich from salt and iron, and they were basically becoming a rival power to the emperor himself. So by nationalizing these industries, Emperor Wu funded his wars and he crushed his political rivals at home in one single brilliant move. But here's the thing, you can't pull off a policy this radical without some serious pushback. And what came next was one of the great intellectual showdowns in all of Chinese history. It was a fierce debate over the very soul of government. So decades after the monopoly was created, all these scholars and officials got together at the imperial court for what's now known as the Discourses on Salt and Iron. And this wasn't just some boring economic debate. No, this was a full-on clash of worldviews. And this was the question at the heart of it all. What is the government's real job? Is it to ensure national security and stability, even if that means getting its hands dirty in business to make a profit? Or should it stay above all that and just act as a moral guide for the people? So on one side, you had the legalists. These were the pragmatists. They believed in a strong state above everything else. They're arguing, look, this monopoly is essential for national security, it funds the army that keeps invaders out, and it protects people from these greedy private merchants. But on the other side, you had the Confucians. And they were coming from this moral high ground saying, whoa, a government chasing profit? That's just dishonorable. It corrupts the whole society. And they had a really practical point too. They said, hey, these state-run iron factories, they're making terrible, useless tools that you're forcing poor farmers to buy. You know, the Confucians made this really powerful moral case. But in the end, pragmatism won. And why? Well, because the threat of invasion wasn't a philosophical idea. It was real and it was immediate. The monopoly provided the money for soldiers and walls. That's tangible security that, time and again, outweighed the philosophical arguments against it. It was too valuable to ever let go. And get this, by the time of the Tang Dynasty, the salt monopoly wasn't just a source of revenue, it was the source. At its absolute peak, it brought in more than half of the entire central government's income. Let that sink in. Over 50%. It had literally become the economic bloodline of the empire. And the system, it got more sophisticated over time too. At first, the government tried to do everything themselves, production, transport, the whole shebang. But later on, they pivoted to this really clever public-private partnership. Basically, the state controlled the source and set the price, but then it sold licenses to private merchants to handle all the risky and expensive parts like transportation and distribution. And what this did was create this whole new class of incredibly wealthy salt merchants, especially in cities like Yanshu. I mean, these guys built unbelievable gardens. They sponsored famous artists. But here's the catch. Their fortunes were completely dependent on the government's goodwill. So yeah, they were rich, but they were never, ever a threat to the state. So you can see, this wasn't just some ancient Chinese policy, it was a model, a blueprint for bureaucratic resource control that would end up being copied all over the world for centuries to come. In the West, this kind of state monopoly on salt eventually became known as the gable. And while the name is European, the blueprint, that was perfected in China. This model proved that a powerful state could finance its entire operation on a single resource as long as it could control it. And here is why all of this matters to you, right now. That fundamental idea, taxing what people buy instead of what they earn, is the direct ancestor of our modern sales tax, or VAT. In a lot of developed countries today, these kinds of consumption taxes make up a third or even more of all government revenue. Guangzhou's invisible tax is still with us. It's just on a much, much grander scale now.
I want you to really, truly think about that for a second. Imagine walking into the grocery store to grab a container of salt, and the price tag is the same as your salary for 2 entire months. It's unthinkable, right? It sounds absolutely insane. But for millions of people living under feudal or colonial rule, that wasn't a thought experiment. It was their reality. And that kind of daily injustice, well, it can only go on for so long before something snaps. So why salt? Of all things, why salt? Well, it's actually pretty simple. You have to have it to live. I mean, your body literally cannot function without it, especially in hot climates. And for most of history, it was the only reliable way to preserve food. So when you have something that is an absolute, non-negotiable part of survival, you've got the perfect commodity for a government to control. You control the salt, you control the people. It's a direct pipeline into the pockets of every single person in your empire. Now, we're going to look at 2 of the most infamous examples of this strategy in action. First, there's the French gabelle, and then there's the British salt tax in India. Both were incredibly cruel, but they went about it in fascinatingly different ways. One was a system of, let's call it, administrative chaos. The other, a picture of brutal imperial efficiency. And the difference between the two is just wow. On one hand, you've got France. The country was carved up into this bizarre patchwork of 6 different tax zones. The price of salt in one province could be 20 times higher than in the province right next door. It was a system that was basically begging people to become smugglers. Then, on the other hand, you have the British in India. Their approach was much simpler and way more direct. A total monopoly. They just made it flat out illegal for any Indian to make or harvest their own salt. You wanted salt? You had to buy their expensive, heavily taxed salt. Period. Let's dig into the details of it, because this is where it gets really wild. In France, they had something called the devoir de sel, or the salt duty. The state didn't just tax salt. It forced you to buy a minimum amount every year for every person in your house over the age of 8. To enforce these invisible tax borders, they had a special tax police force, the Gabelous. Now, if you think that's crazy, listen to what the British did in India. They built something that sounds like it's from a fantasy novel, a 2,500-mile customs barrier fortified by what they called the Great Hedge of India. We are talking about a 12-foot-high, 14-foot-thick wall of thorny bushes, patrolled by 14,000 men, all to stop people from smuggling a basic seasoning. It's just mind-boggling. Of course, these weren't just abstract government policies. They had a real, devastating impact on millions of ordinary people. And it's that staggering human cost that we really need to understand next. So in those high-tax parts of France, if you are one of the poorest people, say a farm laborer, you could expect to spend nearly 10% of your entire year's income just on salt. Just the legally required salt. Let that sink in. 1/10 of everything you earned, gone. And all while the nobility and the clergy were often totally exempt. And if you think that's bad, in India, it was even worse. This brings us right back to that first question I asked. For a typical Indian laborer, the cost to buy enough legal, taxed salt for his family for a year was equal to about 2 months' wages. The result? People simply couldn't afford it. They ate less salt, which in a hot tropical country led to widespread disease and suffering. This chart just lays the exploitation bare. Look at that tiny little sliver at the bottom of each bar. That's the actual cost of making the salt. All the rest, pure, unadulterated tax. In France, the tax could inflate the price by 10, even 20 times. It was nothing less than a massive transfer of wealth from a starving population straight into the government's bank account. And what happened if you tried to get around these taxes? Well, the punishments were beyond brutal. This quote says it all. In France, you could be sent to the galleys
forced to row on a ship until you died, a fate many considered worse than death, for smuggling salt. We're not just talking about a fine, we're talking about flogging, being branded with hot iron, or even execution, all for trying to buy salt at a fair price so you could preserve a little bit of food for your family.
You can probably guess that people didn't just sit back and take this. Of course not. But the ways they fought back in France and in India were completely different, and they led to two very different revolutions. One path was violent and secretive, the other was public, peaceful, and brilliant.
In France, resistance gave rise to the faux salteniers, the false salters. This created a massive underground economy. Smugglers, men, women, and even children, risked absolutely everything to move salt from the cheap zones into the expensive ones. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse with the tax police, and it often exploded into open, violent revolts against the entire system. But in India, the resistance was a masterclass in political strategy. In 1930, Mahatma Gandhi organized the Salt March. This was pure genius. He walked 240 miles to the ocean, and then, in front of crowds and journalists, he did something incredibly simple. He bent down, and he picked up a lump of natural salt from the beach. With that one quiet act of defiance, he broke the law, and more importantly, he broke the fear of the law. He showed millions of Indians that they could peacefully defy an unjust rule. Making salt became an act of independence. So, how on earth did all this resistance, all this anger over a simple tax on a simple seasoning, actually help bring down two of the most powerful empires on the planet? Well, let's get to the incredible conclusion of this story. And here it is, the final reckoning. In France, the boiling anger over the gabelle was one of the key fuels of the French Revolution. It's no surprise that one of the very first things the new National Assembly did in 1790 was get rid of that hated tax for good. And in India, the Salt March poured gasoline on the fire of the independence movement. It united the nation in a common cause and was a critical step on the road to freedom from British rule in 1947. So here's the big takeaway from all of this. When a government starts taxing something people absolutely need to survive, that tax stops being about money. It becomes a personal, daily, unavoidable reminder of oppression. For the French, it symbolized the deep injustice of the feudal system. For Indians, it symbolized the exploitation of foreign rule. The salt tax made tyranny a real, tangible thing that people tasted in their food every single day. And that is a recipe for revolution.
You ever stop and think about how globalization really got started? Okay, so let's dig into this. The whole story really starts with a simple fact. We as humans need salt to live. It's not optional. But, and this is the key, it isn't found everywhere. And that imbalance, that gap between a biological need and where you can actually find this stuff, well, that's what kicked off global trade. And just try to imagine how ridiculously hard it was to move this stuff. It was a complete logistical nightmare. For starters, it's heavy and bulky, and oh, by the way, if it rains, it literally just dissolves. So solving this massive challenge is what forced us to build the world's first real infrastructure, the roads, the routes that became the lifeblood of ancient commerce. And when it comes to solving a problem like that, well, nobody did it quite like the Romans. Their solution to the salt problem didn't just get them some seasoning for their food, it literally paved the way for their entire empire. Let's just take a look at the Via Salaria, the Salt Road. It started out as just a simple dirt track. Then, what do you know, the city of Rome is founded at a perfect strategic point right along that route. And as Rome got bigger and more powerful, they transformed that dusty path into an engineering marvel, a paved superhighway. It actually became the blueprint for all the famous Roman roads that would eventually crisscross their empire.
And that's where you see the real power of this kind of infrastructure. The Salt Road was never just for moving salt. It became the highway for moving entire legions, for sending out imperial decrees, and for basically pulling the whole Italian peninsula together into one unified state.
All right, now let's jump to a totally different part of the world, a completely different environment. We're gonna leave the stone roads of Italy and travel to the vast deserts of Africa, where another culture solved the exact same problem in a way that couldn't be more different. Out here, there were no paved highways. The challenge was crossing the Sahara. One of the most hostile environments on the entire planet. The solution they came up with was honestly one of the most incredible logistical feats in all of human history.
Can you even picture this? A single caravan, the Azalai, might have up to 12,000 camels. These weren't just trade missions. They were basically moving cities. Think of them as the ancient world's equivalent of today's massive container ships, connecting completely different worlds.
And if you want to get a sense of just how much salt we're talking about, get this. In the mining town of Tagaza, salt was so ridiculously abundant that they actually built their houses out of blocks of it. Yeah, houses made of salt. Mainly because there was literally no other building material around.
But here's the thing. This trade wasn't just about survival. It was about creating immense, unimaginable wealth and power. This flow of salt became the economic engine for building entire civilizations.
The whole system was powered by a super simple imbalance. The north had mountains of salt, but zero gold. The south, deep in West Africa, had unbelievable amounts of gold, but they were desperate for salt. You see where this is going? It created the absolute perfect conditions for a massive trade network.
In the value, it was just astronomical. We have historical accounts that tell us, during times of scarcity, salt could trade literally weight for weight with gold. Just let that sink in for a second. A pound of salt for a pound of gold.
So you see, this salt for gold trade was way more than just commerce. It was the economic engine that fueled the rise of the great West African empires, Ghana, Mali, Songhai. It's the money that paid for the legendary libraries and universities of Timbuktu, and it became the vehicle for spreading ideas and culture across the continent.
And believe it or not, this ancient history is still with us. It's hiding in plain sight, in a word you probably use every single month. So let's zip back to Rome for a moment. Roman soldiers were completely dependent on salt for their health and for preserving their food on long campaigns. Because it was so essential, they actually got a special allowance, a special payment just to buy it.
This allowance was called the salarium, and that word comes directly from sal, which is just the Latin word for salt.
And there it is. The salarium is the direct origin of our modern word salary. So every time you get a paycheck, you are using a word that connects all the way back to a Roman soldier's ancient need for salt. How cool is that? So when you put it all together, it's pretty incredible. From these engineered superhighways in the Roman Empire to vast camel caravans crossing a desert, the fundamental, desperate human search for this one simple mineral is what built the very first arteries of ancient commerce.
You know, when we think of weapons, our minds jump to gunpowder, steel, maybe high-tech drones, but what if I told you that one of the most powerful weapons in history, a weapon that could bring entire armies and even nations to their knees, was something you probably sprinkle on your food every single day? Yeah, today we're going to talk about how simple salt became the white gold of war.
And look, that's not just some exaggeration from a supply officer. Nope, that quote comes from General William T. Sherman himself, a guy who knew a thing or two about how to wage total war. See, he got it. He understood that to really defeat an enemy, you don't just fight their soldiers on the battlefield. You go after their ability to even function. And to do that, you attack their salt. So what does that really mean? It means salt becomes what we call a strategic resource. And this is a really key concept for everything we're about to cover. Think of it like this. It's any basic, seemingly simple thing, could be food, could be fuel, or in this case, a mineral, that's so fundamental to an enemy's survival that if you take it away, the whole system just collapses. It's that hidden vulnerability, the Achilles heel of an entire war machine.
And honestly, there is no better example of this in action than the American Civil War. This wasn't some accident, not a random shortage. Oh no, this was a deliberate, cold, calculated military strategy. The Union's plan was to literally strangle the Confederacy from the inside out. All right, so here's the setup. The Union, they controlled the seas. They had a massive, powerful navy. Now the Confederacy, they had the exact opposite problem. They were critically low on their own salt production and had to rely almost entirely on getting it from overseas. The Union leadership looked at this, saw this huge imbalance, and just went, bingo, they'd found the South's logistical weak point. And the effect of that Union blockade, it was immediate, and it was absolutely devastating. I mean, the price of salt just skyrocketed. We're talking from just a few cents for a sack to, get this, over $200. This wasn't just some inconvenience. It was a full-blown economic crisis that slammed every single household and every single soldier's ration. And the human cost, wow, it was staggering. It got so desperate that families, they were literally digging up the dirt floors of their own smokehouses. These are places where meat had been cured for years and years, and they would boil that dirt just to try and reclaim the tiniest little drops of salt that had dripped down. Can you even imagine? And this wasn't just some local issue, a problem in one or two towns. No way.
This crisis went all the way to the top. You had state governors sending these frantic, panic letters to the Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, basically screaming that the entire civilian population was on the brink of total collapse, all because of this salt famine.
The Union's plan was just, well, it was methodical, and honestly, kind of brilliant in its cruelty. It was a 3-step attack. Step 1, use that big navy to blockade the ports, cut off all the imports. Easy enough. Step 2, send in raiding parties to hit all the small coastal salt works, places down in Florida. Their job? Just smash all the boiling kettles. And then, step 3, the final blow. Go after and destroy Saltville, Virginia. Why? Because that was the Confederacy's last major source of salt on their own soil.
And you have to understand, this wasn't just a military problem anymore. The salt famine was tearing at the very fabric of Confederate society. You had salt riots breaking out in major cities like Atlanta and Mobile. Women desperate to feed their families were just looting stores. And when the government tried to ration what little salt was left, it just made things worse. It highlighted how powerless they were to provide for their own people, and that undermined the entire war effort.
Okay, so this whole strategy, attacking a fundamental resource, it wasn't some one-off thing in the American Civil War. Decades before that, a very similar, though maybe less intentional, logistical failure completely doomed another massive army. We've all heard the story, right? General Winter defeated Napoleon in Russia. But, well, modern science is telling us a very different and much more specific story.
So let's really ask the question, what actually defeated Napoleon's Grande Armée? Was it really just the cold? Or was General Winter just a convenient story to cover up a catastrophic failure in logistics? A failure that, you guessed it, comes right back down to salt.
Yeah, the popular myth, the one we all know, blames the freezing cold. And hey, don't get me wrong, the cold was absolutely brutal. But the reality? The reality was a complete and total breakdown in the Army's supply chain. And this breakdown started long before the first snowflakes even fell. See, as Napoleon's army was marching towards Moscow, their supply lines were getting stretched thinner and thinner. So by the time they turned around to retreat, they had nothing. No salt to preserve their meat, and this is the crucial part, no salt for their horses. And right there, that's where the disaster really kicks into high gear. An army back then literally ran on horsepower. And horses, they need huge amounts of sodium to function, especially when they're working that hard. Without salt mixed into their food, Napoleon's horses just started to weaken and then die off. We're talking massive, massive numbers. This just created this devastating domino effect. Suddenly you have no horses. What does that mean? Well, it means the heavy artillery cannons, they just get abandoned in the snow. The supply wagons, with whatever little food was left, stranded. The whole organized retreat just dissolves into a desperate, chaotic free-for-all. The army's mobility, its entire backbone, was completely broken. So why? Why is this one little mineral so unbelievably critical? Let's dig into the hard science of survival for a second, because this applies to both the soldiers and, of course, the animals they completely depended on.
Okay, so for the soldiers, they're eating unsalted meat. And let's be honest, it was often rotting horse flesh. This led to just horrible dysentery. And here's the biological reason why. Salt is absolutely essential for regulating your body's fluids. Without sodium, the electrolytes in their cells were just thrown into complete chaos. Their bodies couldn't hold on to water, and they couldn't properly absorb nutrients from the little food they did have. This just massively sped up starvation and hypothermia. And for the horses, well, their biological need for salt is even higher, and it just wasn't being met. The result? Total collapse.
And here's the thing. We don't even have to guess about this stuff anymore. Modern science has confirmed all of it. DNA analysis from mass graves, from the bodies of Napoleon's soldiers. It shows they were just riddled with diseases. We're talking typhus, trench fever, salmonella, all pathogens that are directly linked to malnutrition and eating spoiled food. Food that couldn't be preserved because they had no salt.
So, after all that, after these two pretty grim stories from history, what's the big takeaway? How does this lesson of salt warfare actually apply to us, right here, right now?
I think the crucial lesson here is that the most dangerous threat, it isn't always the most obvious one. An army, or heck, even an entire nation, can be brought to its knees by attacking its most overlooked, most mundane necessity. It doesn't matter if it's salt back in the 19th century or something totally different today. The principle of finding that one strategic resource, that stays exactly the same.
You see, for most of history, getting this simple mineral was one of the absolute worst jobs you could have. I mean, truly brutal stuff. Empires literally built entire systems of coercion, huge, complex systems, just to force people to dig it up.
turning them into nothing more than tools to be used and thrown away.
So, where do we start? Let's kick things off with the Roman Empire. For the Romans, mining salt wasn't a job you applied for. No way. It was a punishment. It was state-sponsored production, and the price was paid in human lives.
They even had a legal term for it, damnatio ad metalla. And listen, this was so much more than a prison sentence. It meant they stripped you of everything, all your rights, your status, your humanity. Criminals, prisoners of war, anyone the state wanted to get rid of, they were sent to choke on dust in the mines or bake under the sun in the salt pans. It was a death sentence, just a really, really slow one.
And this is where it gets really chilling. The Roman legal philosophy behind this reduced a human being to what they called an instrumentum vocale, which literally means a speaking tool. Can you imagine? You weren't a person anymore. You were an object, a piece of equipment, to be used to get salt out of the ground until you just broke. That was the cold, hard logic that helped power an empire. But here's the thing, this wasn't just a Roman problem. Not at all. We see this same pattern pop up all over the world, from the jungles of the Americas to the middle of the Sahara Desert. The specific methods were a little different, sure, but the basic idea was always the same. If you control the labor, you control the salt.
And we see two really different ways of doing this. On one hand, you have the Mayan Empire, which just used brute military force. They'd take war captives and force them to work. But then you look at the Sahara, and the Masafa tribe did something kind of different. They weaponized the environment itself. The desert was the prison. It was so harsh, so deadly, that the enslaved workers had no choice. They were completely dependent on their masters just for the basics, just to stay alive. Let's zoom in on that Mayan system in Guatemala for a second. It was incredibly organized. War captives were locked in caves at night, and then, at sunrise, they were marched out to the salt pans to work. All that salt they produced, it was basically money in the bank for the Quiche rulers. And check this out for efficiency. The very same stone blades they used to hack away at the salt, they used those same blades to salt and preserve fish right then and there. The whole operation was integrated.
Okay, now let's jump over to the Sahara. The legendary traveler Ibn Battuta, he actually went to one of these salt mining towns, a place called Tagaza. And his description, it's just haunting. He called it a village with no good in it. Just a miserable, awful place full of flies and bad water, with no one living there but the enslaved people forced to work the mines. And the level of entrapment here is just staggering. I mean, these workers were so isolated in the desert, they completely relied on caravans to bring them food. If a caravan was late, people starved. Simple as that. And the final cruel twist? The houses they lived in were built from the salt blocks they cut from the mine. They were literally living inside their own prison, entombed by the product of their own misery.
All right, for our last stop, we're going deep, deep underground in Europe. We're heading to the Wieliczka salt mine in Poland. And this place is all about contrast. A really stark contrast between the absolute misery of the work and the unbelievable beauty that came out of it.
So the workers here were serfs. They were legally tied to the mine for their entire lives. It's not exactly the same as the slavery we've been talking about, but it was still a brutal form of forced labor. And the dangers, my goodness, they were just constant. You had the daily fear of a cave-in, you had deadly, invisible methane gas that could explode at any moment. And just imagine the horror of a fire breaking out when you're trapped in a maze deep underground. But in the middle of all that darkness and all that danger, something absolutely incredible happened. These miners, the same men who were prisoners in this mine, started to carve. They carved breathtaking works of art. We're talking exquisite salt chandeliers, even entire chapels, like the famous Chapel of St. Kinga. All of it sculpted straight out of the very rock that imprisoned them. That right there, that collision of beauty and bondage, that is the hidden story of salt.
So we've been to Rome, the Americas, Africa, Poland.
What's the common thread here? What ties all these stories together?
Well, if you look closely, a very clear, very repeatable pattern starts to show up.
It's basically a three-step playbook for exploitation. Step 1, salt is almost always found in nasty, hostile places: deserts, deep mines, marshes. Step 2, to get people to work there, the powerful create systems of forced labor, whether it's slavery, serfdom, or condemnation. And step 3, the huge profits made from all that forced labor, they flow straight to the top, funding lavish empires and monarchies, while the people doing the actual work are left trapped at the bottom.
Stories of gods, unbreakable promises, even magic.
That's exactly what we're going to unlock.
Yeah, I know. It sounds like the beginning of a really weird joke, right? You've got ancient scripture, sumo wrestlers, and Slavic hospitality. I mean, what on earth could possibly connect those three things? They're from completely different worlds.
Salt. It turns out this humble, everyday mineral is actually one of the most powerful symbols humanity has ever come up with.
So, how did that happen? How does salt become so important? Well, to figure that out, we got to look beyond the salt shaker. And the whole thing starts not with some kind of magic, but with a really simple, observable scientific fact. One little property that created an entire universe of meaning.
And this is where the human brain does what it does best. It makes a huge leap. Our ancestors thought, okay, if salt can stop meat from physically decaying, then maybe it can also stop our souls from spiritual corruption. Suddenly, something temporary could be made permanent. The impure could become pure. The thing that was supposed to fade away could now last for an eternity.
So naturally, this idea of preservation flows right into one of the biggest themes in religion, promises or covenants. I mean, think about it. If you want to make a promise that will last forever, what better symbol is there than the one thing you know that seems to stop time itself?
This is where we get something called the Covenant of Salt in the Hebrew Bible. And this isn't just any old promise. It's an unbreakable, permanent bond with God. The logic is simple. Salt doesn't rot, so a promise sealed with salt can't be broken. Ever. And this isn't just ancient history. This idea is still alive today when people dip bread in salt on the Sabbath. They're literally reconnecting with that eternal promise.
And get this, it wasn't just a suggestion. It was a direct command from God. Salt had to be included with every offering. But why? Well, it was to make sure the sacrifice was preserved and purified. To make it worthy of a god. It was like a spiritual disinfectant, cleaning the offering before it was presented. Okay, this is one of my favorite parts. There's a clue hidden right in our language. Look at the word salvation. It actually comes from the same root as salt. Think about that. To be saved originally meant to be preserved, saved from spiritual rot and corruption, in exactly the same way salt saves food from physical rot.
All right, so if salt can keep good things pure, the next logical step is it must be able to push away impure things, right? And this idea wasn't just in one place. It popped up all over the world, turning salt into a go-to tool for spiritual protection.
And check this out, it's a fantastic parallel. In Japan, in Shintoism, salt, or shio, is used to cleanse what they call kagare, which is basically impurity. Then, halfway across the world in Catholicism, salt is traditionally mixed right into holy water specifically to help exorcise evil. I mean, how amazing is that? Two completely separate cultures landing on the exact same idea. Salt is a spiritual shield.
And if you want to see this in action, look no further than a sumo match. When you see those wrestlers throwing handfuls of salt into the ring, that is not just for show. It's a deeply important ritual. They are physically and spiritually cleansing the ring, driving out any bad vibes or evil spirits before they begin their match.
Salt was so crucial to survival that some cultures even turned it into a god. The Aztecs, for example, had a goddess named Huixtochihuatl. She was the goddess of salt and fertility, and they would make sacrifices to her just to make sure the salt supply wouldn't run out. It really shows you just how tied in salt was to the sacred cycle of life itself.
So, we've talked about how salt connects people to the divine, but its power goes way beyond that. What about how it connects people to, well, each other? It turns out salt also became the ultimate way to seal a deal between human beings.
Let's head over to Eastern Europe. In Slavic cultures, there's this amazing word, chleba-solstva. It literally translates to bread salty. And it's not just a word, it's a whole concept. When you offer someone bread and salt, it's not just like saying welcome. It's the absolute highest form of hospitality, of bringing someone into your home and into your circle of trust.
The ceremony itself is really simple but packed with meaning. First, you give your guest bread. That represents life, sustenance. Then you offer them salt. That represents the preservation of that life, the flavor of life. When you share those two things, you're forging a bond. You're basically saying, you are safe here with me. Our friendship is now sealed and preserved. And yeah, refusing that offer, that's a huge, huge insult. Okay, let's pull all of these threads together. We've gone on this wild journey, right? All the way from a basic mineral you have in your kitchen to this incredibly powerful symbol that has shaped religions, rituals, and even friendships all across the globe. So what's the big takeaway here? It's really this. Our ancestors noticed a simple scientific fact. Salt stops things from rotting. And from that one observation, we built an entire universal language. It's a language where a grain of salt can mean forever, it can mean purity, and it can mean this is a bond between us that can never, ever be broken.
So let's just jump right into the big paradox, right? Why do we crave salt so much when we're always being told it's bad for us? If you've ever found yourself reaching for a bag of chips and feeling a little bit guilty about it, well, it turns out it's not really about your willpower. The answer is literally written deep inside our evolutionary code, and that's exactly what we're going to unpack.
To get a handle on our weird modern relationship with salt, we've got to go way back. I mean, way back. Picture a world without supermarkets, a world of open savannas where our ancestors lived. For them, finding salt wasn't just a nice to have, it was a genuine life or death mission.
Okay, so this right here really changes how you think about salty food. That craving, what scientists call our salt appetite, it's not some kind of modern flaw. It's a powerful, hardwired reward system in our brains. Evolution made salt taste incredibly good for one simple reason: to make us go out and find it. Because for almost all of human history, our survival absolutely depended on it. So how exactly did we get so good at hoarding salt? Well, check out this first step. When the very first vertebrates crawled out of the salty ocean onto dry land, they basically had to bring that ocean with them, inside their bodies. Then, our bodies evolved this amazing hormone called aldosterone. You can think of it like a little drill sergeant just yelling at our kidneys to hold on to that sodium. And the results? Our bodies became masters at conserving every last grain of salt, which was a huge, huge advantage for thousands and thousands of years. And for all that time, this biological system was a masterpiece of survival. It worked perfectly. But then, in what is really just a blink of an eye in evolutionary time, everything got flipped on its head. We entered what you could call the Great Salt Inversion.
This timeline just shows you how shockingly fast the whole game changed. For nearly all of human history, salt was as valuable as gold. Wars were fought over it. But then, starting in the late 1800s, the Industrial Revolution completely rewrote the rules. All of a sudden, new technology made salt one of the cheapest, most common minerals on the entire planet.
And this then versus now comparison really drives that point home, doesn't it? Salt went from being this precious, rare mineral that you'd use carefully to preserve food for survival to being a super cheap industrial ingredient that's just showered onto processed foods to make them taste better and last longer on a shelf.
This sudden explosion of cheap salt wasn't just a matter of convenience. Oh no, it quickly became the secret weapon of the entire modern food industry. Yeah, for the processed food industry, cheap salt was an absolute miracle for the bottom line. It could hide the not-so-great flavors of cheaper ingredients, it could make processed meats feel better texturally, and this part is just wild. It makes food hold on to more water. And what does more water mean? More weight, and more weight means more profit. Oh, and the fact that it makes you thirsty, well, that's a fantastic bonus if you also happen to sell sugary drinks. Just let that sink in for a second. By adding salt, manufacturers could sell water at the price of meat. That one idea is pretty much the core of what some have called the conspiracy of palatability. It explains why massive amounts of sodium started getting hidden in foods you would never even think of as salty, like bread or cereal, all to tweak their properties and make more money. So, what happens when you take a body that is perfectly designed to find and hoard every last bit of salt it can find, and then you're suddenly flooded with a completely endless supply?
This phrase right here gets to the absolute heart of the problem. It's called an evolutionary mismatch. That's when a trait that was once a huge advantage for survival becomes a serious liability because the environment has changed so drastically. Our ancient biology, which was literally a lifesaver on the savannah, is now working against us in the modern supermarket. And the scale of this mismatch, it's just staggering. Our bodies are built to run on just a tiny bit of sodium a day, maybe a few hundred milligrams. But today, many of us are eating 10 times that amount, or even more, without even realizing it. And the health fallout from this massive overload is severe. Our poor kidneys are still listening to those ancient commands to hoard salt, and they just can't keep up. All that extra sodium makes our bodies hold on to fluid, which jacks up our blood volume. That extra volume puts this immense, constant strain on our arteries and our heart, which directly fuels the global epidemic of high blood pressure, stroke, and heart disease. So it's really no surprise that this public health crisis has kicked off a fierce political battle. You could almost call it a modern version of the ancient wars that were fought over who controlled this vital mineral. And you can see here, the battle lines are drawn pretty clearly. On one side, you have public health groups pointing to a mountain of scientific evidence, arguing that we need to regulate and lower the amount of sodium in our food. And on the other side, you've had powerful industry groups who, for years, have fought to protect their profits by creating doubt around that very science. It's fascinating, right? The debate used to be about the state's right to tax salt, and now it's about its responsibility to regulate it.
So, at the end of the day, this is the really complicated mess we're left with. We've got a biological craving that was forged in an ancient world where salt was scarce. We've got a modern industrial food system that got incredibly good at exploiting that craving for profit. And we have a massive public health crisis because of it. It all boils down to this fundamental question: who's responsible? Is it on us as individuals? Is it on the companies? Or is it on the government to step in? It's a tough one, and definitely something to think about.